It is the year 2472, and the Earth has suffered a great calamity. Hundreds of years of popular culture have vanished. Without the sacred films and texts for guidance, civilization is devoid of anything cool. Then, 3 incubation chambers are unearthed, and from within, men from the time of the great blockbusters emerge. Now, through highly interesting conversations, they share invaluable insight about what once was. The movies, the shows, the comics, toys, and books. This is
The Hyperspace.
Podcasting in the 25th century.
Welcome in, podcast pioneers, to the hyperspace, podcasting in the 25th century, the interweb's first and still only podcast. My name is Jared.
My name is Matt.
I'm Mike.
Mike, it seems like to me like you may need a stim shot. You gonna head down to the future 7-Eleven and get a stim shot?
Well, if I can't find my usual death stick dealer.
You know, death sticks in the 25th century are nothing to play around with, Mike. I hope you're making a joke.
Well, of course I am.
Sure. Do you still go down to the future 7-Eleven, Matt?
I do on occasion, every now and then.
Yeah, you know, they got a new flavor of nutrient paste in there this week.
What's they got? What do they got?
It's a raspberry. It's not bad.
Raspberry?
Yeah. But, you know,
Oh.
it's like that fake, like now and later raspberry.
Oh,
But,
yeah.
you know, it tastes okay.
Now and later's. Okay, look. I have to ask.
Yeah.
When you were a kid, what was your favorite now and later? And what was the worst?
My favorite, believe it or not, was banana.
Yeah, I think that was mine too.
Most
Yeah.
people despise that fake banana
Yeah,
flavoring.
but it was all fake. He embraced it. It was
I
fine.
loved
But
it.
How about the green apple?
Yeah, it was a little tart for me.
It was the worst.
What about you?
You know, now and later I didn't really discover until later in life. And in fact, what year was now and later introduced
I don't know, mid-'80s, I guess.
to the public?
Who knows? Yeah, probably in the 80s sometimes.
I really don't remember it being a part of my childhood, to be honest with you.
I see.
But I would say cherry. I like cherry flavored now and laters. They're tasty.
They are good.
They got a rich, strong flavor to them.
A rich, strong flavor.
What are we talking about here?
I'm talking about now and laters. I'm looking this up on the future Wikipedia page. I'm looking up the history. Oh, they were introduced in Brooklyn, New York in 1962.
Wow.
Holy cow.
So they're not new.
No, but they did gain prominence after this company merged with Leaf in 1983. So that's probably when they started to really become more of just than a regional candy.
When they went mainstream.
Yes, when they blew up.
They went corporate. They sold out.
They totally sold out, those dang now and laters. But anyway, you know, I don't
wonder
know
where the name comes from.
Well, because they last a long time, and they also pull out dental work.
Like, you ever chomp down on a Jolly Rancher and you got like lockjaw?
Yes. I had a milk dud pull out a filling once.
Oh, wow.
It just came right out of my mouth, and it was it was terrible. It's not anything you want to experience. And it was an everlasting gobstopper, actually, that wrecked a root canal that I had. I bit down on a gobstopper, and a root canal is, for those who don't know, it's a tooth with a crown on it that is, it's just a tooth that's been hollowed out down to the root and filled in with putty or whatever, and there's a cap put over it, and I broke the crown and shattered the dental work inside.
So that
there was
3-cent candy caused how much damage?
That was about $800.
Did you wind up getting an implant?
No, they were able to salvage it.
Really?
There was just a husk.
Man.
but they managed to fix it.
You know you want that implant.
No, I do.
Pull them all. Pull them all.
I do. I mean, I got to get ready for my flight to Mars, so I got to get them all pulled. But anyway, guys, you know, we talk about candies and stuff when we were kids. And tonight, that kind of goes along with a little bit what we're going to be talking about. Wouldn't you agree?
Sure.
Do you guys even remember what the topic of tonight's show is? Guys, we had agreed to talk
I
about...
thought we were doing a trivia.
No, it's not a trivia. Okay, here's a question for you. Mike, when's the last time you paid attention to a message that was sent to you? Wait a second, what's the answer? Who wants to buzz in on this one?
Matt.
Matt, go ahead.
Never.
That's it.
You win this miniature trivia contest. No, tonight, guys, we're talking about books that we read as youths.
Utes.
Yes. And,
What's a ute?
And maybe books that kind of formed what our eventual literary tastes became and how that works in a larger pop culture aspect. So, eating now and laters, I'd sit around and read books. That's how we're going to tie this in.
Well, guys, before we get to our books, how about we get into a little random space?
Let's do it.
Random access memory.
On tonight's Random Access Memory segment, I would like to talk about something that just recently happened to me. We're going to be talking about, tell me about a terrible experience that you've had at a restaurant. Like something that stands out to you as a really bad time that you were sitting there paying for and eating.
I'll spearhead this one.
All right.
It's maybe not the worst experience, but it was the most annoyed I've ever been at a restaurant.
Okay.
So I know these things are scattered throughout the country, and most people have probably been to one, but there's a restaurant called The Melting Pot.
Yes. The fondue.
Yes. So this is a classic date kind of restaurant. You bring your date. I had never been, so I went on a date to a Melting Pot, and I kind of knew what I was getting into. I knew it was fondue. I knew you had your little sticks and your little oil, and that's what you did. And I remember thinking to myself, I'm spending $120 to cook my own food.
That's the experience.
Yes.
And I was getting really annoyed at that. And I think my energy was coming off, that I was very annoyed that I was cooking my own food and ruining it with my filet and my lobster turning into coal husks in the oil. And then it all tastes the same after it. So
Sure.
And then to build up for a chocolate fondue, which has so much oil in it, you're visiting the bathroom for a whole night after that, so your date's ruined anyway. So I never saw the appeal of Melting Pot. And if you like Melting Pot, you're probably a psychopath. And you probably need to really deep dive into your own mind and figure out what's wrong with you. And I just I can't I hate the Melting Pot.
Melting Pot.
But it wasn't like it was not like they did something wrong. It was just what it was annoyed me to no end.
Yeah. Interesting. Mike, do you have a story? A terrible dining story you'd care to share?
Nothing's really coming to the top of my head. I can think of there's one that kind of stands out. I wouldn't say this is well, I guess you guys can judge. I'll tell you, and you can say whether you think it was a terrible dining experience. But me and a friend of mine, back in my younger days of working in television, we worked late shifts, so that was just our schedule. We were generally up late, and we went to a Denny's down the road. I'll never forget this. So me and my friend Brian, I'll say his name because he listens to us. We were sitting there, and the manager came and took our order. And as he's taking our order, we're sitting in a booth, and I look at the wall, and there's a cockroach crawling up the wall. So me and Brian look, and we see it, and we turn and we look at the manager, and we know, you can tell that he knows it's there, but he's trying not to acknowledge it. And it's just this real awkward, like, no one's talking about this cockroach that's on the wall. And we neither one of us said anything. He just took our order and walked off. And, we're like, well, that, I guess we should have left. I don't know. We're young and dumb. So we decided, well, we're not going to tip, obviously. So as we were walking out of the restaurant, the manager comes running up to us, and he goes, "Can I ask you a question?" And we're like, "Yeah, sure." And he goes, "Did you guys leave a tip?"
What?
And we're like, "No." And he goes, "Okay, because we've had a problem with one of our busboys stealing tips, and we."
Oh,
So we were like, okay.
So you got like double whammied. You had to have the uncomfortable conversation post cockroach meal.
Yes. And then but when he came out, he's like, "Did y'all leave a tip?" We're like, "Are you serious?" No. I mean, we could have said yes and then got some poor busboy fired, but
Wow. Or maybe he was just saying that as a way to cover, like, "Hey, did you leave a tip? I'm just asking because a busboy's he's been stealing them."
You jarred a memory mentioning Denny's, but I'll go after Jared. Jared, why don't you go?
Well, I mean, I have, of course, everybody has the food poisoning story, the dirty dining story. And I have those, but the one thing that stands out to me, and it's relevant because Mike was a part of this. When we lived in Nashville, we frequented a restaurant called China King. And China King, of course, was one of these sloppy Chinese buffets where you just go and eat until you literally crap your pants in the parking lot after eating. So me and Mike, we lived in Nashville for a couple of years, and for a while this was our spot. So one day we're in there.
I was on break from work.
Yeah, and it's lunchtime. Usually this place is, there's a line out the door. We go, nobody there, nobody, and we kept remarking throughout, "This is amazing. Like, nobody's here. We got, like, the whole place to ourselves. What's going on?" And I don't remember who made the discovery, if it was Mike or me.
No, what happened was I went back to work.
Okay.
And I commented to everybody. I said, "Yeah, me and Jared went to King Buffet, and that place was empty." And somebody goes, "Well, yeah, they just reopened after being closed because all those health violations."
Yes.
And I was like, "Oh."
They have been shut down for apparently incredible filth. And, that story just pops to mind, not because it's a terrible experience, just because it was like, "Hey, man, this is awesome." And you find out later, it's not really that awesome.
I remember Jared and I would go on our birthdays to China Buffet in Tampa.
Crazy buffet.
Crazy buffet. It was a very upscale Chinese buffet.
I think
used
I
to
went
love
with
that
you
place.
one time.
Yeah. You lived down here when we went.
And one of the things that we would always do would be to we'd get a side of sushi, and we would pile on the biggest pile of wasabi that we could handle each, and pop it down in one shot. There was like one day we were there, and the mixture of the wasabi must have been pure gasoline. I took it,
Dude, I remember this.
and I think I had an aneurysm from it.
His nose started bleeding, like blood pouring out of his nose. He's like, "Ah," and he's sitting there going, "Ah," and then the blood just starts dripping out. You called those wasabi hitters.
Yeah, wasabi hitters, right? That was
And to finish up the crazy buffet story, we went there usually annually for Matt's birthday, my birthday, and our friend Mike, the Sith Lord. Every birthday we'd go out there, so we'd be there a couple times a year, 3 times, and it's one of our birthdays. I don't remember which, and we're driving out to the restaurant, and I think it was Mike or Matt. You guys got there first, and you say, "Well, we ain't eating here this year," and they text me a picture on the door that says, "Crazy Buffet's closed. Thanks for the years." And we're like, "What? That quick?" Crazy Buffet was no more.
That was a good memory.
Yeah. And then a few months after that, it was a parking lot. It
didn't take long.
It was gone.
You notice that the Chinese buffet is becoming like an endangered species.
Oh, good grief.
You can't find them anymore. They used to be all over the place.
With social media and Yelp and, people reviewing, it's hard for places like that to maintain a good reputation. I mean, they're not.
I mean, my gosh, when you walk into the place like that, you know what you're walking into.
Well, exactly. But I mean, it's like they still suffer the wrath of the internet like everyone else. And, they're never going to make it.
Back in the great COVID pandemic of the 2020, I don't see how some of those places, if they're still around, even reopen, or in a buffet sense.
Yeah,
there's a pizza buffet near me, and they have reopened since all this.
Is it CC's?
No, it's called Pizza Inn.
Okay.
And the difference is the salad bar is not open. If you want a salad, they'll bring you one, and they have to serve you the pizza off the buffet.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and they're not very busy. I've been there a couple times, and they haven't been very busy. But
wow, well,
as someone like me who just doesn't give a darn,
man,
it's good for your immune system.
Well, Matt, before we move off the food here, do you remember the place off Gulf to Bay?
Sure,
the Oriental Super Buffet.
Super Buffet.
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah,
it smelled like urine.
Yeah, it did, and not functioning anymore.
No,
they
don't make it.
Just recently, they changed their name to something else, like a seafood restaurant, and now that's totally shuttered as well.
Ugh, that's it's probably for the best. It's probably for the best.
Yeah.
Before we move on to our books, Mike jarred my memory on an incident with Denny's. So this is a long time ago. And this is someone who listens to our podcast frequently, so they'll probably know who I'm talking about. So a bunch of co-workers and I were out drinking at a bar late, like really making a night of it. And I had just got, at the time, I got a new Ford Expedition, new for me. So it was a brand new car for me. Had it maybe a week, not even.
I remember that car.
Yeah. So we were really getting loaded at the bar, but I was okay. I was just a couple drinks, but this guy in particular was 3 sheets to the wind. And he had a long drive to go home. So I'm like, look, why don't I just take him to Denny's, sit down for a few hours, we'll get a cup of coffee, let him sober up a little, and, on his way. So I pack him in my car, and we go, and we get him in Denny's. Actually, I should say I get him in Denny's. It's just me and him. And the waitress comes over and obviously sees he's wrecked. And I said, just bring a cup of coffee. He's like, eggs. Give me some eggs. And I'm like, maybe you don't want eggs. How about some toast? He's like, no. Bring me 10 scrambled eggs. And I'm like, maybe some toast with that. So anyways, long story short, he eats all these eggs in like a second. They brought him a bowl of eggs and he ate them all. And he was green. He was like not looking good. So I'm like, hey, are you okay? I said, you're not driving home. You're done. I said, you can crash in my apartment, crash on the couch, but you're not driving home. So I get him out. He's starting to fall asleep in the booth. So that's when I know it's time to get him out of there. So I get him to my car, and I open the back seat. And before I can even get to my door, he leans into my back seat, half in, half out of my car, and starts to throw up everywhere.
Oh my gosh!
And remember, I just bought this car, and he is just all over throwing up. And I'm like, I was yelling every explicative in the book at him. So I grab him by his belt and I throw him on the parking lot. I'm like, stop it. So then I got to still put him in the car. It's just me and him. So I drive him back to my apartment. I drag him up the stairs, probably banging his head the way up. And I just throw him in my living room. And I go downstairs with like paper towels, and I spend the next hour just scooping out this. So one of the things I was active at the time. I was playing like kickball or soccer, one of those things, and my cleats were upstairs. And turns out that he spent the whole night with his face asleep, passed out in my cleat. So I'm like, that serves you right. But yeah, that's the last. I think that's the last time I ever was at a Denny's.
Okay, so from terrible dining experiences to awesome reading experiences. Oh yeah, let's check out what we were reading as young men.
Collected works of Dickens. Collected works of George Bernard Shaw. Poems by Browning, Shelley, Keats. Great dramas of the world. Books, books, all the books I'll need, all the books I'll ever want. Shelley, Shakespeare, Shaw, all the books I want, all the books.
So we've spent a lot of time on this podcast talking about a lot of our favorite television shows and movies that helped shape our minds and how we think and who we are. But we haven't really delved into the books. We've touched a little on it, but we've never gone over that part. So we thought we'd share out some of the books that help shape our imagination and help put us on the path that is our lives. Who wants to kick it off, Jared? You want to go first?
Sure. Well, I remember distinctly the first novel that I read was the novelization of Return of the Jedi.
I'm shocked to hear that.
Yeah, can you believe it? And I remember I got it. It was the same summer that it was released to theaters, and I found it at that time. The church we were going to every year had a flea market. And I found it at the church flea market for like $0.25 or something. Of course, it was Star Wars. So I was like, hey, can I have this? And yeah, so I picked that book up. And I distinctly remember, like, my mom or dad said something like, well, hey, that doesn't have like a lot of pictures in it or anything. You're going to have to read that. And I was like, yeah, I'm going to read it. It did, in fact, have the 8-page color insert pictures in it, as some movie novelizations did in those days. And I remember it's the first time I read the word Palpatine, because he is referred to as Palpatine in the novelization, and I had never heard that before. This is before I read. Palpatine appears in the original Star Wars novelization, but I'd never seen that name before. And I was like, wow, his name is Palpatine? I thought it was a very strange name. But that is like the first, I guess, big person book that I ever read. How about you guys, if you can remember?
I'd always intended to read the Star Wars novelization books. I never haven't read a single one, any of them. But maybe I'll do that. Maybe that'll be my next reading project. Go back and... Oh, he's holding it up.
This is the one from the flea market.
Oh, it's a very good condition.
Yeah.
One of the things, one of the book, it actually turned out to be a book series. I think I was probably in 6th grade, I would assume. The reason, I should say, how I happened upon these books was because I was playing a computer game on a Commodore 128, and the game was called Dragon World.
Mm-hmm.
And the games back then were pretty simple in their design, but it's like that 5-disc game. Please insert side 2.
Oh yeah.
And there was one part where if you went, for example, west at a certain point of the game, it always crashed. And I always went, I'm like, oh my God, what is down this path? I will never know, because I couldn't go because the game would always crash. Always had an error. So I was determined to find out what was down this path. And on the cover of the video game box, it had said from the novel. And I'm like, there's a book out there that this was based on. I'm going to find that book. I'm going to read that book and find out what's going on down that path somehow. That was my goal. So I went to Walden Books with my mom, and I used to love Walden Books.
Oh, Walden Books. Ruled.
It was the best. And I looked all over for it, and I couldn't find it anywhere. Didn't have it. Asked them in their system, in their primitive computer system, and they didn't have it. But I found a book from an author named Anne McCaffrey.
Oh,
this
yes.
was the Dragon Riders of Pern series. And I got hooked on this series, and I thought it was fantastic. If you haven't, I mean, it's a very popular fantasy series. I mean, many people
I've heard of it. I've never read them.
So I started reading these in like 6th, maybe 7th grade, but I think 6th. Basically, it's a world where people and dragons have a symbiotic relationship, and the Dragon Riders are in charge of fighting a menace from space. They call it the Thread. And if the Thread came down from this planet like every 7 years, and if it hit the ground, it would burrow in the ground and destroy all plant life. So they couldn't let any of this Thread hit the ground. So the dragons were responsible for burning it out of the sky when it appeared. So that was their job. And then obviously the politics and stories that go along with that. But it was a great series, and I got really hooked on it. And I used to write stories all the time myself back then. I had my dad's word processor. And if you don't remember, many people have no idea what a word processor is. So let me enlighten you. A word processor looked like a modern day keyboard, only much bigger. It had a little strip of a window. And you would type, and you would see about 8 words go by and keep going by. And your entire paper or story or whatever you wrote, you had to trust was turning out well, because all you could see was 8 words at a time. It just kept cycling past. And then at the end, you would hit print, and it had like a little printer on attached to it, and you print your paper. So anyways, I like these books from Anne McCaffrey. So I read about her. I found out about her, and she lived in Ireland. So I sent her a letter.
Wow.
And I sent her a letter, and I said, hey, look, I'm a kid. I love your books. I think they're fantastic. And I asked her questions. I said, how'd you start writing? What do you write on? You know, how do you come up with these kind of stories? And I got a postcard back from her, hand signed, and she gave me all this information, all this stuff. And over the years, I wrote her several letters, and I had probably like 5 or 6 different letters and postcards from her. One, I got a full letter.
Oh, wow.
And so I had.
So you're like best friends.
We're besties, super besties.
We need to get her on the show.
She's dead, and
well, we can have a seance.
But anyway, so the Dragon Riders of Pern series was one of my favorite series as a kid. I haven't read them in years. I probably will never reread them, but at the time, I probably read the series maybe 2-3 times. But yeah, the Dragon Riders of Pern. If you're a 6th or 7th grader and you want something a little deeper than what you're used to, go read it.
Huh.
Mike, what about you?
Well, my first big boy book I read, I remember, was my mom read a lot of Stephen King, and Pet Sematary had just come out, and she read it, and it was just laying around, so I picked it up, and that was the first novel I ever read all the way through.
How old were you when you read Pet Sematary?
I was in middle school, probably like 6th or 7th grade.
All right. I was reading Dean Koontz in 7th grade, 8th grade, so I guess that's not too bad.
Well, looking back on that, I probably shouldn't have been reading those books at that age. No, I mean, it was, still, I've kind of fallen off. I haven't read any of King's new stuff in years. But back then I was reading a lot of his stuff, and that's still one of my favorite books that I read by him. And then, had the great ending, the cliffhanger ending. So yeah, that was I don't know if that started. I don't think it started my interest in horror. I mean, I always had like an interest in horror, but that was, back before, having access to all the, to whatever movie you want to watch. I mean, books were like, you get a hold of a book, you get a hold of as many books as you want, and you could read as much as you want and get those type of stories. So, yeah, that was my first really grown up book that I read, and I enjoyed it a lot.
Wow.
And I still think it's good. I've read it a couple times since then.
I need to read some Stephen King. I've never read a single Stephen King book.
Well, Salem's Lot's like my favorite novel by him. His first few novels are great, but then you kind of get spotty, hit or miss.
Yeah,
Like
I think we talked about this on the podcast, I think, last season. But I got to pick a few out. I want you to I'll get on the chain. You recommend a few Stephen King ones that I could start with.
Shining. Shining's fantastic.
Yeah, I got to do The Shining. What about It? It worth reading?
See, I think that's his first bloated book.
Uh-huh.
Like, that was the first book of his I've read where I was like, it's okay.
Mm-hmm.
It had that weirdo scene where the kids were having sex. So that was kind of odd. But no, it's never been in one of my favorite books.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you guys are kind of putting me to shame because if, I did read a lot, but I guess you would say I'm a bit of a poser in that I read a lot of licensed material being, usually what I was reading was connected to a movie or a TV show. But I do remember like the first legit sci-fi novel I ever read was 2001. My dad had a copy of it in his office, and it had been there since I was born, and I'd seen it, and I looked at, it also had the photo insert. It came out after the movie had come out, and, there was spaceships and astronauts, and it looked really cool, but it's not something I ever, even with my interest in Star Trek and Star Wars, I never really got into it. But I was 13 when I watched 2001, and like that movie like melted my brain. Like, well, for like a 13-year-old who, I recognized then, like, holy cow. I mean, that's like it immediately started, making me think about things. And I was like, and Dad's like, yeah, he's like, that's a great science fiction. It tries to make you think about things. So, I mean, I remember talking to my dad about it. I was like, what does it mean? Why did he get old? What's the Star Child mean and all this? And he goes, well, let's watch, this was 1988. So he's like, look, let's go rent 2010. And, so we went and rented 2010. And that 2010 is, I think it's a much more palatable film.
Much more Hollywood.
Yes, it's not so esoteric and strange, but it is a little bit more run of the mill, but in a way that kind of made 2001 easier to understand for me.
Yeah, I agree with that. 2010, I think, is a very much overlooked movie. I think it's a pretty good movie. It's probably more of a time capsule movie now if you look at it, if you watched it now. But I was very entertained by 2010. I watched it all the time.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a much more watchable movie than 2001. Because with 2001, you really kind of have to be in the mood to watch that. But I was really fascinated by that world, so I read my dad's copy of 2001, and it was much different than the movie. In the movie, they go to Jupiter. In the book, they go to Saturn. And there's other details that are kind of mixed up and moved around. And then I read 2010 after that. And 2010 is actually, it's not necessarily a sequel to 2001, the book. It's more of a sequel to the movie. But it also doesn't, it shares qualities with 2010, the movie, but it's not, it's so much bigger and there's a lot more going on. And I was just really wrapped up and fascinated. So I did eventually end up reading 2061 and 3001, which was the final book in that particular series. And I thought all of them were really interesting to certain degrees. 3001 came out in the mid-90s, I think. And it was really kind of weird. It involved Frank Poole, who was the astronaut who Hal ejected into space. He had survived. They found him floating in space out by Jupiter, and he was perfectly preserved. So in 1,000 years' time, they're able to revive him and it's about basically his experiences with the in these worlds in the new world he went back to, and Dave Bowman's presence and the monolith and Hal is still involved, kind of tangentially. They're always kind of in the background, but one thing I remember about 3001 is that they had genetically modified velociraptors who were servants. They were hyper intelligent dinosaurs who basically became like the slave labor of people.
What year was that written? Do you know?
It was written shortly after Jurassic Park. So
wow.
So it definitely it was very easy to visualize these raptors while reading that book. But
it's funny. I didn't know.
So that was a series that it started with movies, but it kind of went off into its own thing, and I did keep up with that until eventually he 3001 was the final entry, but they were always interesting, if a bit strange.
Yeah, I don't think I'm ever going to read those. I enjoyed the two movies. I don't think I could go past 2010. But bully for you.
Yeah. Well, I would say 2061 is probably better than 3001 because it involves like the return of Halley's Comet, and they're gonna try to land on it, and Dave Bowman and Hal get involved again. So it's kind of interesting, but yeah, that was from the late 80s to the early 90s. I was really into those books.
So I mentioned on the podcast before that my mom was a big sci-fi fan, and she kind of really got me into a lot of books, at least steered me into trying some as a kid. And one of the authors that she steered me to was Robert Heinlein. And Heinlein is still one of my favorite authors of all time. I was lucky that when I was in college, a buddy of mine liked Heinlein also, and his little like pet project was he liked to go to bookstores or like Salvation Army or Goodwill, that stuff, and look for books and see if he can find a Heinlein book. Because back then, Amazon didn't hit the scene until, 98?
Yeah, late 90s.
Yeah, you just couldn't order books online, so you went out and you searched for them. So this guy had developed a Heinlein library that was very impressive. He had almost every one of his books. He wrote a ton of books. But before I got to college, two of my favorite books were Stranger in a Strange Land and Starship Troopers. And if you've never read Starship Troopers, I highly recommend reading it. It's much better than the movie. Even though I like the movie, it's campy.
It's completely different. It's like Starship Troopers is just straight up action. They have some of the ideas, but no, the book's really good.
And the book is actually a pretty quick read. It's not a big book. It goes by very fast. It has some very interesting ideas that the movie kind of touches on, but doesn't really get behind.
I think the difference is the book feels like it's promoting the ideas, and the movie seems to be making fun of the ideas.
Yeah, that's kind of what happened. But it's more of a satire. The book is more of a statement on where Heinlein thought governments wanted to go. It was almost a warning, is what it was. But the book is fantastic. And Jared, have you ever read Starship Troopers?
No.
You should pick it up. It's a quick read. You get to experience Johnny Rico and the mobile infantry and all their mechanized goodness. Because in the book, the mobile infantry they're wearing these power suits, and they basically are like a strike force to themselves. And in the movie, they're just a bunch of jarheads all charging in, to get the bugs. But in the book, each mobile infantryman wears it like a big, mechanized power suit, and
kind of like Edge of Tomorrow.
Yeah, and they're just wrecking machines.
They even
soldier.
drop them from the ships and all that.
So it's but yeah, that was a cool book. I like that book a lot. And so Robert Heinlein.
There is one big difference from the book and the movie. I always thought was interesting is in the movie Rico's parents are killed. Yeah. But in the book, he runs into his dad, who had survived the attack and ended up joining
at the very end, right?
Yeah, which I thought was kind of strange, but
they had an interesting kind of motif, which they touched on in the movie, but the book was very heavy in it. And in the future Earth, if you served in the military, you earned the right to be a citizen. and that meant you had the right to vote. And if you didn't join the military and you didn't serve, then you weren't a full citizen and you didn't have the right to vote. So it was interesting kind of motifs that Heinlein was presenting at the time. But great book. Robert Heinlein, a lot of great stories. Orphans of the Sky, a good short book. Tons of good stuff from Robert Heinlein. Check it out if you haven't. Mike, take it away.
Well, I'm gonna help Jared out here a little bit. Early on, I've read a lot of licensed stuff as well, and one of the first things I really got into was there was a series of V novels from the TV series, first it was the mini series and then turned into a TV series. And there was a whole series of V novels. And I remember I read the novel that was based on the two miniseries, V and V the Final Battle. And then they had another book called East Coast Crisis, because the TV series takes place in LA, and this was like everything happening like in New York and that area. I remember that was just really interesting. And also I just, it was like the first time you see like, oh, these stories I've watched have been expanded to, and through novels is where you get more stories.
Yeah.
And so I remember I read a bunch of those books. I used to get those because they had the two main ones, and then they had like a bunch of the shorter novels. But I remember it was kind of got confusing because the continuity was like they seemed to follow a continuity, but then they seemed to started following the continuity of the TV show. I mean, it was just like, I remember I was like reading one book. I'm like, what is going on right now? Where does this take place? I don't know. It wasn't consistent, and it kind of drove me crazy a little bit.
Yeah. Well, that was kind of a curse of those licensed products back then. There was no I don't think real oversight into things like continuity or because I was from the late 80s to the late 90s, I was all about the Star Trek novels. They would put out a new Star Trek novel, once every few months, and I remember I would go to Walden Books, and you'd see a new cover of a novel that you hadn't seen yet. It was very exciting. Back when I was reading them, they were these really nice painted covers, and really cool.
Who was the artist that did a bunch of them?
His name was Keith Birdsong. And
there's another guy. What's his face? Boris.
Yeah, he did a lot of the early ones. Boris Vahelo. Yeah, he did
great covers.
Yeah, but I was all in for those Star Trek books back in the...
I read them like crazy. I read a few dozen of those books. They were great.
Yeah, and they were usually self-contained, so there was really no progression of anything happening. Like one of the books would take place during the movie era, and the next book would take place during the 5-year mission.
Yeah, you could always tell by the covers what uniform they were wearing.
Yes.
Who was it? It was a J.M. Dillard?
J.M. Dillard, yes.
Yeah, J.M. Dillard wrote a lot that I like. He wrote one, it's called, like, the Lost Years or something.
What's funny is I'm rereading The Lost Years right now.
Really? No kidding.
On my Kindle.
I remember really liking The Lost Years.
Yeah.
I remember Enterprise was a good one. The Prime Directive was good.
Yes.
But yeah, The Lost Years was, I think, one of my favorites of that bunch.
Yeah, it took place after they finished the 5-year mission and between the motion picture.
Right.
It's interesting to go back and of course I've got like I don't know, something like 700 Star Trek ebooks on my hard drive. So occasionally I'll just I'll pick some old favorites and go back and knock them out real quick on the Kindle. But
I gotta do that.
It's and what's interesting is there's still Pocket Books is still cranking those out to this day.
It's amazing.
It's like pretty soon they're literally going to chronicle every second of James T. Kirk's life. It's like, okay, we have now covered his entire life from cradle to grave.
We've mentioned before, Star Wars is such a big part of our childhood, but Star Trek was huge because of the books for me. I mean, my day-to-day was a lot of Star Trek because of those books.
Yeah.
You know, and not that Star Wars wasn't pumping out novels like this, but they didn't even compare to what Star Trek franchise had.
Star Wars didn't really start until the 90s.
Yeah.
I remember
91.
I never really read any. I read a couple of them, but I mean, like Jared was saying, I mean, you were always seeing Star Trek novels.
Yeah.
Always.
Walden Books was the best place, and there's always that whole wall of just the Star Trek books. It was great.
And if you can still find like a Barnes & Noble or a Books A Million, there's still going to be a wall full of Star Trek books. They're still there.
I don't know how popular they are anymore, but they were sure popular with me. I love them.
Yeah.
I wish I still had them. They all got shuffled away in one of the moves.
You know, in recent years, I've seen one or two that the covers, mostly, you know, Kirk era stuff, the covers have really piqued my interest, and I've actually read a couple of the newer ones. One's put out in the last 5 years or so.
Have they done any novels with the new timeline?
You know what? They just released one, and it was supposed to be released back when the movie came out like 11 years ago. But it didn't get released, and it's by your favorite Alan Dean Foster. And right now it's the only pocketbook novel that's set in that Kelvin timeline.
Was it an adaptation of the game?
No, it was not. Thank goodness. Nobody wants to adapt that. Woo! That game was rough.
All right, who's next?
Yeah, I think we're back to Matt again.
I'll round mine out. I'll finish mine with my favorite book and series.
I was wondering when this would come up.
It's no surprise if you listen to this show that Dune is my favorite book of all time, and I've read it. I can't tell you how many times I read Dune. But I remember it was 1985 or 1986 where I was visiting family, and in the room I was staying, I noticed my cousin had all the Dune books, and I remember thinking, oh, I've heard of that movie, and I'm interested. I remember seeing, I'm like, what are these books? I've never seen. I didn't realize there were these books. I just thought it was some movie that you heard about, because the movie had come out like 2 years before, but I was like 11 years old, and I hadn't seen the movie. So I wound up shortly thereafter watching 1984's Dune, which I love, but the movie is so weird. I mean, as a kid, you can't make heads or tails of what you're watching. And so I went to Walden Books and I bought Dune. And man, it blew my mind away. That book is so dense and so crazy. And it's just such a great read. I recently convinced my brother-in-law to read it. And I think since within like 6 months, I think he's read it like 3 or 4 times.
Wow.
But Dune and that whole series is such a thought-provoking, interesting take on humanity and politics and intrigue and family. It's just it's much more than just straight science fiction, although I think you can say it sets the bar for science fiction literature. I see Mike's holding up Dune right now. Well done, Mike. Dune, to me, is the benchmark in science fiction as Lord of the Rings is to fantasy. And it's just an amazing read, and it's such a huge world. And, you know, the concept of world building in literature is taken for granted when if you don't read these books, and all of a sudden you get a hold of Dune, you get a hold of Lord of the Rings, the same thing. You read, how expansive and how big these ideas and these worlds are, and how complicated these authors have made these worlds. And it's just amazing that someone like Frank Herbert could do this. And, what's interesting is to see how much Dune has influenced in science fiction and movies since its release in 1965.
I still have my copy I bought in 7th or 8th grade.
Nice.
It's movie themed. It's got pictures of the movie on the back.
Oh, that's fantastic. Yeah, mine is the original cover. I actually have a first edition Dune. That's one of my prized possessions. So
really,
with the original dust jacket on it and all that. So it's a great condition.
I have a first Kindle edition Dune. There it is.
Well done.
It's right next to the Lost Years, as you can see.
Oh, look at that. That's funny.
It's funny. That book is kind of intimidating because it has the glossary and the appendices and all that stuff. But it's really not that hard of a read, I don't think.
Well, it's interesting that you say that, because the Dragon Riders of Pern kind of prepped me for this kind of read, because Dragon Riders of Pern also had appendices and indexes to learn the vocabulary and the syntax of that world. So I had already been kind of used to that kind of thing. So when I got into Dune, I'm like, oh, this is cool, but it's so much bigger than anything I'd read. And it's still one of the biggest books, concept and density that I read today.
Well, I read it when I was 15. One of my friends we had a deal going. Like, he would read 2001 if I read Dune. Mm-hmm. So it was sort of like I begrudgingly did it. I was like, okay, I'll read it, because he loved the movie and he loved the books, and so I read the first one, and I did enjoy it, but I just got intimidated by like all the subsequent books. Like, I figured, like, man, am I going to have to read, like, what is it, like 6 more books?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, and not even counting the new stuff that I even know, Matt, you've read all the prequel stuff they wrote.
I powered through them, and they are what they are. They don't compare to the original.
I remember you like bringing that book to work or something. It was one of the Kevin J. Anderson ones. I was like, how is that? You're like, oh, it's okay. I powered through it.
Those books are like a first draft. I mean, they're so long, so unnecessarily long.
They were co-written by his son, right?
Right, yeah.
So, the good thing about Dune, the original Dune series, not the prequels or the sequels as they're making, is that Dune is a standalone novel. You can read it, and you don't. It's almost like Star Wars. Star Wars is a standalone movie. You didn't expect a sequel, and Dune is that kind of book. It doesn't lead you into a cliffhanger. Yep. It doesn't lead you into anything. And I typically just read Dune by itself, and I rarely go into the extended series. I think I read through them all last year, just because I haven't done it in a while. And it's interesting, and they're all very different books, and they're all very interesting books. They're not my favorites, but I like the whole series as a whole. But Dune by itself is my favorite, and as a standalone, it's worth reading.
See, yeah, I like Dune. Dune Messiah was good. Mm-hmm. Children of Dune, I thought was okay. I thought God Emperor Dune was actually pretty good. I actually like that book a lot.
Yeah, people like God Emperor and the original, and Dune itself are the two books that people tend to go back and forth with as their favorites.
But after that, Heretics and Chapter House are just like, what?
It goes off the deep end. Yeah, it goes off the deep end.
What happened here?
I think that may have been one of the reasons I didn't continue, is because I felt I got a complete experience in one book. Like you said, you weren't being pushed to read further.
Yeah. And I think if somebody hasn't read Dune, and to your point, you see this giant series ahead of you, disregard it. Read the first one, and if you like it and you really enjoy it and you want to go further, go for it, but you don't have to. Dune is a perfect standalone silo novel. Well,
I'm going to reread it before the movie comes out. That's my goal.
Yeah.
I think.
There's my brother-in-law is funny. He a buddy of his, a good friend of his, also reads Dune. It's his favorite novel also. And in his work, he names his projects from the book, and like he'll have people going like, "What is this? What is Sardaukar?" He's like, Sardaukar. He's like, the elite troops of the Emperor. He's like, so he names all his projects from Dune, so everyone thinks he's crazy. Yeah, read Dune. Dune is one of those books that if you're into science fiction, I think everyone should at least read it once. It's
don't be intimidated by it. It's actually a pretty easy read. It's not super heady.
Yeah, and even though it has strange language and things to learn,
it's easy to follow.
I'd say once you're about 700 pages in, it's fine.
It's not that long.
No, I'd say once you get in it and you're in a couple chapters, once
you get used to the rhythm of it.
Yeah.
He read the book all by himself.
He's able to read the book without adjusting the glossary. He must be the chosen one.
He knew his way. Mike, why don't you finish it up?
Okay. So this was one I actually read in my freshman year of high school. So does that count?
Sure.
Yeah, of course, sure.
Well, Fellowship of the Ring.
I knew it. It had to be.
Yeah.
Those books, aside from some senior. I don't know if it was a senior. It was like I guess I was a freshman. And he was like 1 year ahead of me. Ruined the freaking ending for me to being a jerkwad. But man, those books. I mean, because I remember, I read The Hobbit. I'd read The Hobbit in middle school, and I liked it. I think I read it a couple times, and then I finally read The Fellowship of the Ring, and it's just such a completely different story, different mood, and it's just when you read it, you feel like Tolkien had actually been to Middle Earth.
Yeah,
he's like,
to say the least,
describing blades of grass and stuff like that, and you're like, what in the world? But I'm not one of those people. Like, I know people like have books they read once a year or something like that. I haven't read it in a few years, actually, especially with some of these newer books that before he passed away, Christopher Tolkien released. The one I read was Children of Hurin, which was actually really good, but it was really depressing. It was a downer. But I've read the Silmarillion. A lot of people can't read that. I had no problem reading. I liked it a lot. I've read Unfinished Tales, Lost Tale. I haven't read the Lost Tales. That's really heavy. But Fellowship of the Ring, I mean, it was just really good.
They're great. They're great stories. They're amazing books. It's funny because when I was a kid, they had the animated movies.
Yes, that was my first exposure.
And
me too.
Jared, didn't we rewatch them? Didn't we watch them where the second one's the rotoscoped one?
Yes, that
Lord of the Rings, the actual movie is a lot of rotoscoping. It's almost like live action.
It's terrible. It's terrible. But like The Hobbit and
Return of the King
were in my brain forever because I remember watching them and just loving those movies. And then reading the books many years later, almost forgetting the movies, it all started coming back to me. And I'm thinking, oh, that's right. That's what this story is. And I totally forgot about it. And those books are unbelievable stories. They're unbelievable. And they're easy to read. And they go by really fast. And they're just amazing books. They're just fantastic
Well,
books.
I don't know about easy to read. I remember the Council of Elrond took me a good month to get through.
All right, fine. Maybe there's some parts that slow down.
But I started reading those right after I saw the trailer for Fellowship. I was like, that looks really cool. I finally need to sit down and read these. And I read Two Towers and Fellowship and before those movies came out, but I never got to Return of the King before I saw the movie. I have since read it.
I remember when they were catapulting heads over the
Yes.
wall. That really freaked me out. Like, what? Those movies are pretty grisly.
Yeah.
Those books are pretty grim.
But they're really great.
I just bought the illustrated Hobbit, hardcover Hobbit.
Yeah.
I'm going to start reading that to my son on his 5th birthday. I'm going to start reading at night.
Well, that's
Just
cool.
little excerpts from that and just take him through the story. So I'm very excited. Hopefully, I can keep it in good condition because someday I'd like to give it to him. And
yeah.
But I'm hoping I can kind of get that story going in his young brain and have him fall in love with it. Although he'll probably be like, this sucks. Get this out of here.
Well,
but I'm hoping it's the latter. And it's kind of a cool, it's not fully illustrated. It's got sporadic pictures, illustrations inside. So that hopefully that helps him along at 5 years old. But I'm looking forward to it.
Well, I always credit my dad with getting me interested in all this stuff. But he had never read a Lord of the Rings book prior to seeing the Hobbit movie.
Really?
Yes. And after he watched the Hobbit, he just watched the first one, Unexpected Journey. He jumped in with both feet to all things Tolkien. I mean, my dad's in his 70s, and he's just retired, and he sets up in his office poring over maps of Middle Earth, and my mom thinks he's crazy.
Oh, that's fantastic.
But,
good for him.
And he calls me. He's like, hey, do you remember the extended version of Return of the King, and is this and that? And I was like, well, man, you know way more about this than I do now, because he's gone back and bought all the, the art books and the unfinished stuff from Christopher Tolkien. He's become like a Tolkien scholar in his twilight years.
Well, I mean, with the DVDs and Blu-ray, I mean, the DVDs of Lord of the Rings kind of set the standard, I think,
Sure.
for behind the scenes and featurettes and stuff. I mean, the inclusions that they put in those DVDs at the time were, I don't think anybody had ever like showing us now. I don't think anybody had ever seen that kind of inclusion in DVDs before. I mean, it was amazing.
Yeah.
Just for the movie part of it.
Those Blu-rays are incomparable. And, you know, my mom said my dad disappeared for a month upstairs in his office watching every special feature from those releases.
I remember doing that. I remember like going through the gallery. There's so much still gallery stuff in there.
Each disc has approximately 12 hours of video content. And that doesn't include like the 5 audio commentaries that is another 4 hours a pop. It's insane.
I just put those on my Plex.
Okay. Mike in his digital archiving.
Unlike the movie Dune in 1984, the movies were very, I think, pretty as true as you could be.
Fellowship of the Ring was almost like word for word.
So I'm excited. I'll give it an update when I start. It's in July. I'm going to start to read The Hobbit to my son, and I'll give you a little updates how that goes.
You should live stream it. Come here, young man, as I read you this tale.
Our new normal.
So, yeah, before we totally wrap it up, I have to give honorable mentions to just general movie novelizations in general.
Choose your own adventure.
Well,
Oh, man.
choose your own adventures, of course. But for me, like movie novelizations, they were like gold mines because you got extra scenes. You got into the characters' heads in ways. I could not get enough movie novelizations. And, all the way through the 80s and 90s.
Someone who didn't get these a lot as a kid, sometimes that's like I read Gremlins before I saw the movie.
Wow. But, it's one of my favorite movie novelizations to this day is Back to the Future. It's there are a lot of small differences, and it's an interesting read. It was like my holy grail for many years because I found it at this bookstore when I was a kid, and I started reading it, and my mom wouldn't buy it for me. And it was a good 10 years before I found it in a used bookstore. And it was like gold. You could not find that sucker anywhere, but I found it. So, yeah, movie novelizations, and of course the books put out, the Star Wars books put out in the 90s that sort of revitalized the fandom there. Those were staples for me. But we've talked a lot about Star Wars. There's no reason to get deep on that. But, the Thrawn trilogy was a really awesome return of those characters and sort of got everybody excited for for new Star Wars to come. So that's about the extent of my literature.
I was going to give an honorable mention of all things to The Lord of the Flies, believe it or not.
Wow.
You ever read that?
I did.
They made us read
school.
that in high school or maybe middle school. I don't remember.
of Wrath, which I actually think is like a really great novel.
Yeah, I read that too. I don't really remember it too much, but Lord of the Flies stuck with me a lot. I like that concept of being stuck on an island, but not turning into savages. But
Iron Maiden did a song called Lord of the Flies based on the novel.
I'm shocked that you know that, Mike. How do you know that?
Also, Iron Maiden did a song on Dune.
Did they do a song about choose your own adventure books?
And Frank Herbert did everything in his power to get them to not be able to release it.
oh, Frank.
Were they talking to Ish
Lighten up.
about him?
No, they Steve Harris, the guy who wrote the song, was like a huge fan.
They wrote the song like they knew their way.
They wrote the song all by themselves.
So I appreciate this discussion, guys. This is my idea. I was really curious to hear about the books that help shape your young minds.
I've got
today.
a bunch of them behind me there.
Yeah, Jared has kept every book since he was 3.
No, I believe that's Mike. We're talking about Mike now.
No. I'm talking about your books, not his computer manuals and old printer.
Oh, okay.
manuals.
Yeah, fair enough. You know, that's what's missing in the 25th century's libraries.
Yeah,
There's no libraries here.
Well, it's funny you said before we end this, I'm a big proponent, as Jared and Mike know, of the digital age. I'm not a big fan of physical media, but I am a fan of physical books. Although I read a lot on my Kindle, I still cherish having a real book in my hand. I haven't given up the paper yet.
Yeah. There are books I have kept. I have purged a lot of my collection just for space, but the ones that mean something I've kept around and plan on never getting rid of. And Mike just keeps everything. I think we're losing Mike.
I've gotten rid of a lot of stuff here lately.
Oh, jeez. Oh, no.
But thank you for listening to the Hyperspace Top 15 Sci-Fi Podcast.
As voted by FeedSpot.
Fantastic. You should listen. If you haven't, subscribe. We've got a lot of great shows. If you haven't listened to our other companion shows, we have a ton of Star Wars stuff. We love Star Wars.
Yeah, go listen to that.
Check us out. We got hours and hours because we're the only podcast on the interweb. So
Man,
what else do you have to listen to?
Literally, you could listen to our show for almost 2 days straight. Oh, no, over 2 days straight without taking a break for sleeping.
Tell a friend. Have them listen to us. We always like to have new ears.
Yeah, and the countdown continues to the end of Season 2.
Right in the corner, guys.
All right, so we'll be back next week with another fantastic episode from the 25th century!
You know you can't live without this content, so subscribe to the Hyperspace Podcasting in the 25th Century. Follow us on social media, leave us a review, and join us next time as we take you into the 25th century.
That's not fair. That's not fair at all. There was time now. There was all the time I needed. That's not fair. That's not fair.